Hey everybody, welcome back. So in today's video, I wanted to touch upon the topic of trauma and some updated understandings that I've been getting about how to think about it, how to look at it from different points of view. So if you're someone who struggles with, really deeply ingrained, stuck, difficult issues, if you're someone who seems like you have trauma responses, but you don't recall any event in your life that would have given you trauma, any sort of acute event, or if you're someone who doesn't quite understand how you ended up with the issues that you've had, I would encourage you to watch this video. I think you're probably going to get a lot out of it. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get into it. Okay, so as I said in the intro here, I've been going through and learning a lot about trauma recently. I'm just kind of been preparing for some trainings I'm going to be doing over this next year and wanted to get back up to speed a bit more and get a little more educated with approaches to somatic therapy, for example, approaches to working with attachment issues, for example, approaches to just dealing with trauma in general and getting more literate and more educated around this topic because it's so incredibly important, I think, for anyone who's supporting others in personal growth and personal healing and personal transformation. Obviously, for you as self-healers, this is important. And so I wanted to kind of convey and talk about a couple different things here in this video. So let's consider part of this as a touching back upon a very popular video I did a while back, a couple years ago, on CPTSD and psychedelics, my own experience with that, my own takes on that. And then also in this video, I want to kind of address this question of, that I get a lot from people, which is something like, I've got really deeply ingrained issues. I don't know where they came from. I've been stuck with them for years. I was raised in a good, loving household. I don't recall any major incidents that would have given me trauma. There's no divorce. I had both my parents. They both loved me. There was no major physical injury. There was no, nothing that I can look at. I didn't grow up in a war zone, this kind of a thing. There's nothing I can look at and go, yeah, that traumatized me. And yet I seem to have the patterning, the response, the depth of issue, the persistence of issue that someone who comes from a trauma background has. Why would that be? So I want to address both of these points and unpack them a bit more for you and hopefully give you a new understanding, a new lens to look at trauma through that I think will be really helpful and really kind of a revelation for some of you. So let me go ahead and get into it with you here. Let's just cut right to the chase here. And I'm going to do something a little bit kind of unconventional here and give you the punchline, give you the answer, give you what it is that I want you to understand, this new framework or way of looking at trauma first. And then I'll explain to you and tie that back in how that relates to CPTSD, which should be fairly obvious. And also, how it is you can end up with a trauma response, even though you had, supposedly a good childhood and no acute incidents that would have given you trauma. So here's what I want you to take away from this video. And if you don't watch the rest of the video, this will be of value to you. I want you to think of trauma as a spectrum of inputs, right? There's a whole variety of inputs that can land us in a nervous system situation that creates an output of the experience of a trauma response being in our bodies, okay? So at maybe the far end extreme, we have multiple acute instances of trauma happening over a long period of time. That would probably be the extreme end of the spectrum. Maybe a little less extreme from that would be, we have, let's say, single instance trauma, right? Where it's like one big, dramatic, life-changing event happens, kind of like really impacts us deeply. And then, from then on, our nervous system starts to develop this trauma response pattern. Maybe a little more close to center, but still really impactful, arguably as or more impactful would be multiple small traumatic events that maybe we didn't realize were as traumatic as they were, that added up to an experience of being too much, too overwhelming for us and created a trauma response for us. But really this spectrum I want you to think about at the other end would be more like stress, more like chronic stress. So chronic unresolved issues that we don't have answers for, ongoing stressful environments or situations that we're in that just keep going and continue to be an accumulating stressor for us over a long period of time. Toxic relationships, obviously. Things like this. I want you to think of the trauma response ultimately as some sort of deep accumulated stress in your nervous system that got stored in your nervous system, that your nervous system didn't either have the opportunity or the space or the safe relationships to process out. And so your nervous system had some sort of stressful event or lots of stressful events, some that could be really intense or less intense, but just more chronic, that over time add up to this stored stress response in the body that your nervous system doesn't know what to do with and ends up holding on to and kind of growing around and adapting to, that shapes how you experience life. And I think this is really important because if you think about it in that way, then really the work of trauma is about unwinding whatever that stress is, helping the part of your brain or your body that's kind of holding on to that, maybe from a past scenario you're no longer in, discharge that and get updated and present to what is going on in your environment around you and what's going on for you situationally now that might be healthier, safer, or better, right? So trauma work is largely about releasing, completing, sometimes there's what's called completion, which is where you're, moving through some sort of, movement that you weren't able to do in the traumatic situation, or, maybe speaking when you weren't able to speak, or processing through something that got thwarted in the stressful moment. But a lot of times it's just about offloading stress out of your body, letting your body just really let it go so that it can settle back in and recalibrate itself to its own natural, fully adaptive functioning, let's say. Now, that really changes for a lot of us, I think, how we understand, trauma, because then there may not be a single thing you can look at and go, oh, that was the moment that traumatized me. You may not have a memory you can find, no matter how much MDMA therapy you do, that gets you to that thing, right? It may just be an ambient, something wasn't right in your environment or in your relationships, or, whether maybe you were bullied at school, or maybe your parents kind of weren't that well attuned to you at home and kind of neglected and ignored you, but you didn't really realize that that's what it was. And you felt lonely or unseen or unconnected to. There's all kinds of examples of different scenarios that can add up to create this sense of accumulated stress, right? And so if you think of trauma healing fundamentally as stress release, as deep nervous system stress release and resetting, I think that really helps you to understand the gig, And so you don't have to necessarily rack your brain trying to figure out why, what happened, what was the exact moment, what was the thing that was said or not said. Putting together the narrative, let's be honest, can be really helpful. And we are deeply linguistic narrative beings. Like, narrative is part of how our brains work. It's part of what makes us human, quite frankly. And so I certainly wouldn't want to take that away from you or say that there's no purpose to it, but at the same time, it's not central or necessary in order to discharge the stress, if that makes sense. So this is the new understanding of trauma I'm starting to arrive at, is that so much of it really just boils down to, sure, you can unpack the dynamics and what happened and, that kind of a thing. But bottom line, the work is really just about reorienting your nervous system to become healthy and adaptive and present. A lot of times, really what's going on with trauma is that some part of our brain is not in the present moment. Some part of our brain is still processing something from the past, or trying to bring that past, let's call it a glitch, the past frozen thing that didn't get processed all the way through in the nervous system. And it's trying to bring that into the present moment and find where that fits and is that relevant. And there's part of our brain that's kind of like stuck in a loop, and that RAM, if you will, if you want to use a computer metaphor here, gets kind of sucked up, reprocessing that thing over and over and over, and we're not as present as we could be. And so a lot of trauma healing is about updating, is about becoming present, is about discharging that stress, undoing the glitch, letting your system no longer be bogged down with trying to process this thing over and over and over that is in the past, right? So I hope that makes sense. I'm going to explain a little bit now how that applies to CPTSD. And I'm going to explain a little bit about how that applies to if you had a good, childhood growing up, but you still have like some sort of significant issue. Hopefully it already makes sense, but let me just kind of speak the obvious here and bring this home for you guys. So to update my understanding of CPTSD, I think that this exactly describes what complex post-traumatic stress disorder is. We have a period in our lives, let's say, that could have been our entire childhood into adulthood, could have been a period in our adulthood, could have been a month, could have been a week, could have been, who knows. We go through a period of time where we experience chronic, repetitive, deeply stressful situations. Often with CPTSD, these will be relational. This will be attachment stuff that wasn't right. This will be, we were neglected. We were, we had dysregulated parents around us. This is another thing. Like if you grow up in an environment where your parents are stressed chronically because they were traumatized and they never learned how to process stuff and they're dysregulated, even if you grew up, without any incidents, that chronic stress ambiently around you will imprint on your nervous system and you will feel chronic stress, even though it may not be originating from you. I mean, if you think about it, if your caretakers are stressed, the kind of deeper signal that sends to our nervous system is something's not safe here. So obviously we're going to feel stressed too, right? So in terms of CPTSD, we have this element of attachment that's usually not right? Either we were really, not treated properly and either ignored or abused, and we end up developing some sort of an avoidant, strategy, or we got kind of inconsistent attention. Sometimes we were tuned into, other times we weren't. Sometimes we were supported, other times we weren't. We develop anxious. We get like a really crazy mix of really unstable household, sometimes being super loved on, sometimes being, really not treated right. We end up with some sort of disorganized attachment, right? And so there's this attachment piece that's usually what's driving the complex stress. So the stressor usually is something relational that wasn't right. And so the work then, obviously with complex PTSD, really boils down to not only just discharging the stress, but discharging the stress around relationships or relational dynamics, or creating and experiencing contrasting relationship inputs. In other words, safe relationships with people that don't exhibit that pattern of whatever there was in the past. That kind of helps us to get different inputs and different information that helps us to unwind that, right? Obviously in psychedelic therapy, what that can look like, may not always, but could, depending on who you work with, is some form of you reopening that critical learning period. I'll be doing a video on critical period soon. Or let's say opening up the neuroplasticity, if you want to think of it that way. And then, with your consent in a safe container with a safe practitioner, there's someone there holding a relational energy that is the counterbalance to whatever patterned you in the way that it patterned you, and kind of heals that wound, right? So if you grew up with anxious attachment, that might be someone who's really attuned to you and helps you feel a consistency. If you grew up with, avoidant attachment, that might be someone who really helps you to know that you are safe, that you're attuned to, that you're not abandoned, but that you have the room to be yourself, right? Something like that. And so when you get these kinds of messages in a safe container, while your brain is open from whatever psychedelic you took, kind of reopening that critical learning period, it can re-imprint it, you end up healing, transforms you, voila, right? So this is how we can use psychedelics and safe relating with the right therapist, and that's really going to be a huge key piece here, to start to undo CPTSD. This is the more thorough way to do it, the more aligned, healthy, dare I say, correct way to do it. But yeah, in general, with CPTSD, this is what we're dealing with. We're dealing with a chronic relational wounding that created a chronic stress response in us that gets locked in the nervous system. So what there's to do is to release the stress and have a different relational imprint there. And that can be done also, by the way, through imagination. As a hypnotherapist, as someone who works with visualization and mental images and that whole layer of the mind, that can also be a very valid way to re-imprint ourselves once we get ourselves in the right state first. So it can be done that way too. But that's generally kind of what we're looking at with CPTSD. And this is how it's done. So often why CPTSD, in the video that I made a while back where I said essentially that I had CPTSD for a long time, took a shitload of psychedelics, did not heal my CPTSD. This is why. Because essentially, I didn't have the relational input and I wasn't discharging the stress through the psychedelic. So the psychedelic will not, in and of itself, necessarily cause you to discharge the stress, nor will it necessarily give you the right relational inputs. Don't get me wrong. I was surrounded by some truly incredible human beings along the way, many of whom were profoundly sweet and kind to me at exactly the right moment and touched me and I don't mean literally, but emotionally, spiritually touched me at the deepest level with their kindness and their love and their sweetness and their attunement. But I think, that was always in a context that was social already and maybe not therapeutic in nature. So it didn't really reach all the way into the place where it really needed to go because I wasn't really activating that core stuff in those situations. So that's kind of my updated thoughts on CPTSD and using psychedelics to heal it. I hope that makes sense. If you have any other questions, do ask me down below in the chat, or feel free to email me if you want to have a more private conversation. That being said, I'm now going to talk a little bit about why it is that we can kind of have a good upbringing and then end up with a trauma response pattern. Hopefully it's starting to make sense, but let me just kind of make it obvious here. Then we'll wrap the video. One of the things that blows my mind is that there's still a lot of people out there who only think of PTSD as being this kind of single instance, acute, dramatic, life-changing moment, right? Like someone who goes to war, God forbid, they survive, encountering an IED and their friend gets blown up right next to them. Something tragic like that, right? A fatal car accident that we survive and someone else didn't, that kind of a thing. What I see a lot are people who clearly have trauma responses that they're grappling with, whether they are fawning all over the place, whether they are in a freeze state of some sort, whether they're in a fight state of some sort. And they don't realize that what they're dealing with is a form of PTSD response. And I'll say to them, this seems like a trauma response. And they'll be like, well, I didn't have any trauma. I grew up great. My parents loved me and everything was fine. And there's no problem. I didn't, no dramatic incidents in my life. I grew up normal. I don't know why I have this response. And I don't think it's trauma is what usually gets said to me. So that sounds like you. Hopefully this is starting to make sense. You could have just grown up in a situation that was chronically not quite right for your development and therefore stressful. For example, maybe you went to a school that you didn't like and all the kids around you kind of made you feel uncomfortable. Or a bunch of other situations like that. Usually it's going to be something more relational to parents, but not always. But the bottom line is if you had some sort of a chronic stressor in your life that happened over and over and over, maybe a problem you couldn't solve, you're like, gosh, I feel insecure about this aspect of myself. And it really was a thing that kind of resonated for you and you fixated on and you didn't know how to get past or let go of. And it created a chronic stress response for you over time, that can accumulate and turn into a PTSD response, aka you numb out, you freeze, you have anger issues, you're depressed, you have anxiety issues, you are escapist in the extreme, you let me see what else, or you're a people pleaser and you try to talk your way out of everything and people please your way out of everything, charm your way out of everything, and end up dissatisfied with your life because you're never being authentic with people because you're terrified to be authentic. How do we end up with these patterns? We end up with these patterns because there's some chronic stressor there. So again, the work, I'm just going to kind of wrap with the same obvious message here, but hopefully this clarifies things. The work here is to undo that stress, to start to repattern that stress. And if there's a relational attachment wounding thing here, to repattern that, to find some sort of, and psychedelics, obviously, like I just described, can be used as a way to kind of reopen our nervous system to having a positive, healing, contrasting experience to what we'd experienced in the past, and really start to create a different imprint that can last. So I just want to kind of put that out there because I feel like this is the kind of thing so few people understand, yet so many of us are dealing with. So if this hits home for you, I would love, just to see a comment, or if you want to see this video get shared via the algorithm, do consider giving a thumbs up. If this is your first time seeing me and the channel, do consider liking and subscribing. If you want to follow and get more of this kind of content. And if you vehemently disagree with me and think I'm a total idiot for talking about any of this and way out of my depth, feel free to let me know down below too. If you want to get in touch with me, if you have questions you want to make private, or you want to talk to me about working with me, having some support around whatever it is you want to transform, feel free to hit me up. My email will be in the description down below. And I think that covers it for this video. Much love to you, whoever you are, wherever you are in the world. I'm truly wishing you well-being and health and happiness. And I appreciate your time and your attention here. Much love.